This is the story of TWA Flight 843. On the 30th of July, 1992, an L-1011 was planning to fly from New York's JFK Airport to San Francisco. The flight had 280 passengers and 12 crew members on board. At about 5:16 p.m. EDT, ATC came on and cleared the plane to taxi to runway 13 right. The runway was more than 14,000 feet long, more than enough for this L-1011 tristar to get airborne. By 5:40 p.m., the plane was at the runway and the first officer was at the controls, ready to take his plane into the sky. The captain acknowledged their takeoff clearance. Power was advanced and Flight 843 was on its way to San Francisco. As the plane picked up speed, the captain called V1, indicating that they could not reject the takeoff after this point. They went past their VR speed and the plane started lifting off into the sky. At an altitude of about 16 feet, the stick shakers activated and the first officer said, "Getting a stall." A stall is a situation in which your wings aren't generating lift to keep the plane in the air. In the cockpit, the control columns vibrated, letting the pilots know that they were very close to a stall. It's designed to draw your attention to it because it's just that serious. The first officer felt that the plane wasn't performing as usual. He felt that the plane could not climb out and handed the plane over to the captain by saying, "You got it." The captain now had a split second to make a life or death decision. The fate of 292 people rested on his shoulders. In the background, the flight engineer kept saying, "Get it off, get it off." They got a transmission from the tower saying, "TWA 843 heavy, numerous flames." The captain saw the runway in front of him. It was unlikely that they'd have enough runway to come to a stop. He checked the status of the plane. The plane had the right attitude for takeoff and the right airspeed, but he felt that the plane would not fly. Here's a quote from the report. Quote, "He said he positively did not believe that the airplane would fly." End quote. 1.7 seconds after the captain assumed control of the plane touched back down on the runway. He applied full reverse thrust and maximum braking, but the plane was not slowing down fast enough. It was almost as if the brakes were losing their effectiveness. In front of him loomed a blast fence beyond the end of the runway. They had just 1,500 feet of runway left, and the plane was still traveling at 100 knots. The captain knew that they would run out of runway before they stopped, so he turned the plane onto the grass. He was confident that he could stop the plane on the grass or the concrete beyond it. As the plane left the runway, a thump signaled that the nose gear had collapsed. Soon, the plane came to a stop on the grass. The captain immediately turned off the fuel and the ignition switches. He asked the first officer to pull the fire extinguishers in the engines. He immediately got on the PA system and said, "This is the captain. Evacuate the aircraft." After that, he went into the cabin to direct the evacuation. They were not out of trouble. They opened one of the hatches on the right side, only to find flames and smoke outside. The captain walked through the plane one last time, making sure that no one was left behind. He was the last one to leave the plane. In about 90 seconds, passengers and crew were beside the plane, watching it burn. Within minutes, the firefighters showed up, and it took them about 45 minutes to get the blaze under control. The burned husk of the plane smoldered on the side of the runway. Looking at the plane, you'd think that it was a mass casualty event, but miraculously, everyone survived. This was due to the amazing work by the crew. It's even more incredible when you consider the fact that the crew did not have access to a few exits due to the fire. Even with that, they were able to evacuate almost 300 people in about 90 seconds. Hats off to them. Everyone performed well, to be honest. The captain, the flight attendants, and the firefighters. The firefighters were on the scene in minutes, but even with that, they couldn't save much of the plane. Why was that? Where did the fire come from? The runway was littered with tire tracks, and that gave them a clue. When the plane touched back down, it landed with so much force that a spar in the right wing broke. That caused a fuel leak. That fuel got sucked into the engine, and that caused a fire. But that doesn't explain why the plane came down in the first place. Talking to the pilots, they understood that the plane stalled, and that's why they had to land the plane even though they were past the point of no return. Looking at the flight data, they found something very interesting. The plane wasn't stalling. It was performing as usual. Had they continued with the takeoff, they would have been fine. Listening to the CVR, they could hear the stick shakers, and the pilots truly believed that the plane couldn't fly. The plane was warning them about a threat that wasn't there. Activation of the stick shaker during takeoff is abnormal. According to the board, pilots in this situation should look at all the information available to verify the authenticity of the alarm. Check the flaps and slats and things like that to see if you're really close to a stall. On top of that, there are lights that would have been illuminated to warn the pilots about the false warning, but it's unlikely that those lights would have been illuminated 2 seconds after takeoff. Also, those lights were not easy to observe in the cockpit. But the board felt that a stall warning was not enough reason to put the plane back on the ground. A stall warning occurs when you're about to stall, so when they got the stall warning, they had time to avert it. The falling sensation that they felt was most likely due to the first officer easing up on the control column when the stall warning sounded. It was not because they were actually stalling. The question now becomes, if they weren't stalling, then why did the stick shaker activate? Before we can answer that question, we need to look at some aerodynamics and some hardware. The plane uses an AOA, or angle of attack sensor, to determine if it's about to stall. The AOA sensor basically measures the angle of the oncoming air with respect to the wings. On the L-1011, there's a tube that sticks out into the airstream. This tube has holes in it that sends air into two sides of a diaphragm inside. Depending on the angle of the oncoming air, there will be a pressure difference between the two sides of the diaphragm. This pressure difference is sent to a servo motor. The motor moves the whole tube assembly till pressure is equalized on both sides of the diaphragm. This data is used to calculate the AOA values. When they looked at the AOA data for the flight, they found something that they did not expect. The left-hand AOA sensor was within bounds, but the right-hand AOA sensor reported values of about 26 degrees during taxi and takeoff. The right-hand AOA sensor was sending the stall system corrupted data, and that's why the plane warned the pilots about an impending stall that did not exist. The data was corrupted. When they tore the sensor down for inspection, they found a fault inside the diaphragm circuitry. But wait, the pilots did a pre-flight test of the stall system before they took off. The test told the pilots that everything was working as intended. As far as they were concerned, the AOA system was working fine. When the investigators checked the system, they found that when a ground test of the system was done, an external signal was applied to the servo motor. After all, the plane needs to be moving quite fast for the diaphragm to work. That means to test the system on the ground, an external signal was used. The ground test therefore did not test the diaphragm circuitry where the flaw was, and so it went undetected. There's one more layer to the story. The faulty AOA sensor had a serial number. This allowed them to check the history of the AOA sensor in question. What they found was troubling. This particular AOA sensor had 8 incidents over a 2-year span. Parts often have issues that cannot be replicated on the ground. So what do you do with those parts? Here's what the report had to say. Quote, on many occasions, components are reinstalled in airplanes different from the one that had the earlier malfunction. End quote. Essentially, they were used as spares. The FAA had a program to weed out parts that had repetitive failures. If a part caused a problem on multiple planes, it was discarded. TWA followed this procedure, but TWA's failure trend monitoring system was based on calendar days. For example, if this AOA sensor caused a problem on the 1st of January 2021, technicians would inspect it and test it. When they found no problems on the ground, they'd put it in the spare supply. Then, months later, let's say on the 1st of March 2021, it would be put back on another plane, and the cycle would repeat. Since they used calendar days, the problem appeared to be spaced out by a lot of time. When you looked at the failures by flight time, they were just hours apart. Had TWA checked the flight time between each failure, the problem would have been detected and this part would have been taken out of rotation. Again, a long list of independent mistakes came together to cause a massive accident. What aspect do you think contributed the most to this accident? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.